Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with how to listen to great music. This is video number 6. And in this video and the next few, we are going to be taking apart one of the great, unbelievably fabulous, but still far too little known masterpieces of chamber music by Johannes Brahms. His String Sextet No. 2 in G major, here played by the Stuttgart soloists on Naxos. A gorgeous performance, by the way, and an unbelievably glorious work. Now, Brahms tended to write things in pairs, and so he wrote 2 sextets in rather close proximity, even though one is Opus 18 and the other is Opus 36. There were a lot of works between the two, or the publishers arranged them that way. But the bottom line is that this is just one of the glories of chamber music. Now, a string sextet has 2 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos. And when Brahms wrote these two, it was a very infrequently used combination. So he sort of had the field to himself. And Brahms, as many of us know, was kind of neurotic and was intimidated by the great classics, which he really knew uniquely well because he'd made a real study of them. So Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven kind of freaked him out. And he was very hesitant and an extreme perfectionist when he did anything that they might have done. But Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven didn't really write any sextets for this combination, so he had the field to himself. And it might be for that reason that these pieces seem to have a certain ease and confidence and relaxed character, which is not always typical of his other chamber music. But the other reason I chose this piece is because when we do these introductory talks, most people want to hear, the standard stuff. They want to hear a guide to music that they already sort of kind of know or have heard of. Now, of course, Brahms, everyone has heard of, so we're okay there, right? But first we did the Peer Gynt Suite, which is an absolute warhorse. I mean, you can't watch a television commercial without hearing the Peer Gynt Suite. The Brahms Sextet, on the other hand, is not going to appear selling things like, diet soda or, feminine hygiene products or car auto part things or any of that stuff. It's just not. But here's the thing I want you to know, and that's the reason I chose this piece. All music written in the standard tonal language that we still employ for the most part, and in the forms produced by that tonal language, which are less employed than they used to be, but they are still, all of that music is going to operate according to similar procedures. It's just the inevitable outcome of the way that the music is written, the style, the aesthetic. And so whether something is a chamber work or a huge symphony or a piano sonata or anything instrumental as opposed to vocal or choral music, where the idea there is simply to set the text for the most part, any of those works, those instrumental pieces, are going to use similar shapes, similar forms, similar modus operandi, adapted to the medium in question. Now, a sextet is a rather juicy medium because you've got 6 string players, so you can do a lot with accompaniments and melodies and passing the tunes around the various players. You can do more than, for example, you can in a string quartet, which only has 4 players, or a piano sonata, which only has 1 player. And you have, of course, a certain richness of timbre as a result of having this group of people together. But it's not the same as having an orchestra. You don't have the same kind of contrast. You don't have the same dynamic range. You don't have the same power. And so the composer is going to have to achieve, the same payoff. That is, wonderful climaxes, fabulous tunes, thrilling developments, using the means at his disposal. So that means that the elements of music that are going to be emphasized will be proportioned differently. It's really very simple, folks. It's very practical, common sense stuff. The recipe will be adapted to the resources at hand. And a genius like Brahms makes something fabulous of it. That's really all there is to it, because the recipe will be exactly right. You don't take a piece like, let's say Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and arrange it for a sextet and expect it to have all the thrill of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony as arranged for orchestra. It just won't. You will hear other things. You'll hear more counterpoint, possibly, that is combined melodic lines that get buried in an orchestral setting. You may hear a more trenchant view of underlying harmony. You may have even more cleanly defined rhythm because you've got individual players doing things rather than a group, which could blur or fuzz it up somehow. All of these things come into play. And so one of the ways that you listen to great music, which is the topic of these talks, is to really understand what the medium that the composer is using is going to give you and pay attention to how it does that. And that requires absolutely no prior experience or knowledge at all, other than knowledge of what it is. In this case, a sextet. So when you're listening to all of these examples, think about sextet-y things. What do you think six players can do? And when you hear something that's arresting, that perks up your hearing, think about the fact that it's being produced by six players. And only six players. And so within the limitations of that medium, Brahms is going to create a masterpiece. And the other thing you need to understand about chamber music, since it isn't nearly as popular as orchestral music, is that because it's part of the same aesthetic and the same sort of basic practice, it's not small. It's small in number of forces, but it's not small in size. It's not small in form. Chamber works are every bit as big as the biggest symphonies. I mean, in terms of length, in terms of time. And so that means if you're going to spend 45 minutes listening to a symphony, you may think, oh, I love the trumpets, I love the brass, I love the woodwinds. In a sextet or a quartet or a trio, you aren't going to hear that. So the composer has to create contrast, has to create ways of not being boring, essentially, in different ways. And you need to pay attention to those ways as well. One of the things I'm going to say right off the bat when we listen to this piece is pay attention to pizzicato. What is pizzicato? Pizzicato is when you pluck a string. And it goes pluck, plink, pluck, pluck a string. That's one thing you can do with an all-string ensemble to create a strong contrast in color, aside from the normal bowing when you're playing a melody. Brahms will do whatever he can to create color, but he uses that color in a very, very special way. I'm telling you right up front, to enhance the communicativeness of the sextet medium. So all I'm saying to you is pay attention, because what does the pizzicato do? It's percussive. It defines rhythm by its very nature, right? It's plunk, plonk, 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 plonk. Whatever they're doing, however they're plonking, you're going to hear a rhythm. It's like almost like a drum. So that's an entirely different element. And Brahms uses it incredibly skillfully in his second sextet. Now, how are we going to get through this thing? We're going to listen to the entire first movement at the end, and we're going to take it apart a little bit to see how it operates and the way that it operates, which is really, really special to this particular work. I think this is one of the absolute most marvelous pieces to introduce anybody to chamber music, because it's so beautiful, number one, but it's also formally so clear. What it's doing is just marvelously lucid. It's just a miracle of communicative and expressive clarity. And, some pieces are more, some pieces are less. And sometimes ambiguity is the point. Composers want to suggest rather than insist. But this piece is pretty insistent, and all in a good way. All in a good way. So we're going to begin with the first movement, and this talk is going to be about the first movement after this sort of general introduction. And this is going to be a long talk because the first movement is 10 minutes long, and we have to save it for the very end and listen to the whole thing. And we're going to listen to it in bits up to that point. The first movement of the sextet is in sonata allegro form, which is the standard operating procedure for most music of this period, from the time of Haydn all the way up until, still now. And Sonata Allegro form, as we've discussed many times in the Haydn Symphony Crusade, if you haven't seen that, you might want to start there too, because there are a lot of very introductory sort of things there. But Sonata Allegro form is a way to organize a large movement in quick tempo. And it is organized according to a very, very specific concept. The concept is that of departure and return. That is, choosing a key, in this case it's G major, as your home, where you begin, going somewhere else, wandering about in other keys for a while, because keys in classical music are locations. So it's a journey of sorts with the themes as the characters on the journey, and then finding your way back home. That's how an overall sonata movement is organized. And it's done in a way which is usually called binary, although it's not really. It's binary form, that is two halves that have three parts. The first part is in the first half, and the second and third parts are in the second half. And it's really very simple when you think about it, because the first half gets you on your way. It's your first stop on the journey, and the second and third parts are wandering around and getting home. That's all it is. That's really all it is. But this sextet does it in a particularly fantastically wonderful way. And because the themes are the actors, the characters, you have to pay particular attention to the thematic material that the composer chooses. Now, the themes in a Sonata Allegro first movement are called subjects. The reason they're called subjects is because there may be more than one theme. There may be all kinds of themes in a subject, or there may be no themes at all. You may just have little motives or gestures or other things that music can do. And so you have to leave your mind open to all of the possibilities. And this is another opportunity to talk about that, because Brahms, who knew his classics, particularly Haydn, extremely well, is very, very sympathetic to the idea that the most important ideas in a movement may not be tunes. They may not be tunes at all. They may be something else. Well, what is something else? I'm going to tell you. First, I'm going to play you the entire exposition. Straight through, no more comment from me, no BS. You just sit there and listen to it. Then we're going to take it apart, okay? And we will, by the time we come to the end, we'll be, I think, pretty familiar with where things are going, what's going to happen. So here is the entire first part, which is called the exposition, the part where you get to learn what the tunes are, what the subject, who the characters of this particular little 10-minute drama are going to be. They are exposed for the first time, and here they are. I hope you heard that there were a lot of characters in that exposition, including an unbelievably gorgeous, I mean gorgeous tune. It could be, a topic for the world's most beautiful melodies series. It's unbelievable. Da, 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 da. Oh God, it's gorgeous. Anyway, what are the noteworthy features of this exposition? The things I want you to keep in mind, the thing I would hope you take away, and when you hear it again at the end of this talk, is that it increases in energy as it goes. Believe it or not, the entire piece is in one tempo. It's all at the same speed. That speed is allegro non troppo, which means quick but not too much. And it doesn't change. But boy, it sounds like it does, doesn't it? Because that has to do, of course, with the volume of the music, how many notes Brahms squeezes into each measure. In other words, how quickly the notes are going, and the rapidity with which the harmony is changing, making you listen forward as it moves on, and the way that he handles rhythm in each section. And I think this particular piece and this exposition is particularly wonderful because of its suggestion of increasing power all the way through. It just builds and builds and builds and builds to a climax and then slowly eases back to the beginning. And it's a wonderful example of that. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're listening because listening to great music, to music in large forms, such as sonatas and these chamber works, which are sonatas for ensembles. A sextet is nothing but what we would call a sonata for 6 players. But listening to that means thinking big, thinking long term. When Brahms writes that first opening squiggle, it begins with a squiggle. Right? That squiggle, he knows where he's going to take it. Well, 10 minutes from now, he's thinking where it's going to wind up. And so he's preparing us for that journey. Everything suggests something to come. And I think that's something also important to try and keep in mind as you listen. It's an unconscious thing. You don't have to say, oh, what is this suggesting? Consciously. You just need to know that things will be happening, and those things will be logical things. It's not going to be like just random, today I'll do this, and tomorrow I'll do that. Not a bit. So let's now take this exposition apart. Now, most expositions in sonata movements have two kinds of music, or 3 kinds of music. Depends on how you count, really, actually. But let's say there are the subjects. That's one kind. The main themes, the main ideas. And each of those occupies its own independent, lovely, but interrelated key area. In other words, one theme takes place in Brooklyn, and the other one takes place in Queens. And in order to get from Brooklyn to Queens, you have to have what I call motion music. In textbooks, this is often called a transition. That could be a tune, or it could just be a lot of agitation and motion, as it is actually here, more or less. I mean, it's thematic. There is sort of a tune-ish thing to get us there, but it's mostly just a lot of sound and fury and moving and hustle and bustle, and it gets us from Brooklyn to Queens. And the speed with which it gets us from Brooklyn to Queens, sort of determines whether you've, taken a bicycle or walked or taken the subway or you're stuck in rush hour traffic. I mean, the composer controls the pace. And the miraculous thing about this piece is Brahms' handling of pace, of the appearance of speed, as I said before. The opening, we're going to play the first subject. The opening is almost rhythmless. And that's intentional. It contains 2 major elements. One is the squiggle. Woulda, 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 woulda. Now, what is it about the squiggle that's wonderful? It has no rhythm. I mean, it really doesn't. It doesn't. It's not dum bum ba dum bum ba dum bum ba. It's not like that. It's wada 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 wada. This is in 3/4. This movement. It's going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. You'd never know it to hear this first subject because Brahms is doing everything he can to phrase the melody across that 3/4 rhythm in such a way that you don't really know that you're in 3/4. He wants it to have a sense of timelessness, of searching, of questing, of looking for something. And that quiet wada, 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 wada behind it all always breaks up that sense of a firm pulse in 3 so that it has that drifting, floating quality. It's quite beautiful. And you don't realize as a consequence that the movement is really moving 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, it's Ach du lieber Augustine, Augustine, Augustine. That's the rhythm. But you don't hear it that way at all. And that's intentional, because Brahms is starting off with a pre-dawn kind of idea, a concept. He's going to wake the music up. And so let's listen now just to that first subject and keep in mind simply that, the idea that it's groping for something and gradually acquiring a certain firmness of outline and energy, and it's going to build up to the transition, to the ride on the subway to Queens. So here it is, the first subject. Other thing to keep in mind with that first subject is that the first theme contains, the actual theme, not the squiggle, not the wada, 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 contains 2 main elements. There is the tune and the tail to the tune. It's ya da 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 da. That's do 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 ba-dum ba-dum ba-dum. Well, that little bit, the dum ba-dum ba-dum ba-dum, is probably the least interesting part of the tune. But don't forget it, because things are going to happen. Things are seriously going to happen. But let's all put that aside for a moment and proceed in order. Now it builds to a big climax. It gets itself together. The outlines firm up. The rhythm starts to get nice and energetic. And we are, boom, into the transition music, the motion music that's going to get us to Queens. And you can hear, this is so obviously motion music. That's what I love about this sextet, because there's no question that everything is doing its job in a way that's immediately audible on first hearing. There's no obfuscation in Brahms's writing of this piece at all. And Brahms could obfuscate with the best of them. He really could. But not here, not here. Here it's all just straightforward, and here we go. The motion music to get us to the second theme. what is noteworthy about this motion music? As I said, it's motion music. It moves. It really moves. It's marvelous, isn't it? You can hear it. You can hear it moving. Chugga, 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 chugga. But it still is not moving in that wonderful 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 rhythm that the whole movement is moving in. There's an underlying pulse that hasn't come to the surface yet, that hasn't been revealed. And when Brahms reveals it is when we finally get to that glorious, magnificent, lyrical, fabulous, stunning second subject. This second subject is at last in that wonderful waltz tempo, which is what it is. This glorious, glorious tune, first sung out by the cello and then handed off to the violin, and you just feel so good when it comes. It just feels so wonderful. Why? Because the rhythm is so simple and clear, and it's what you've been hearing all along without knowing it. It gives it an extra validity when it finally comes in. It's a relief. It's like a release of tension. It's such a brilliant, geniusy thing to do. After all of that quiet, drifty stuff, and then the loud activity stuff, and then finally, here we are in 3/4 time. And here is the most glorious tune, in one of the most glorious tunes, let's just say one, because we haven't talked about Dvorak, in 19th century chamber music. Here it is. I could listen to that 1 billion times and never tire of it. And of course, the glory of it is that you don't hear it that often. And there's a reason for that too, which we'll get to in a moment. But that whole tune, as you heard, is develops itself into another big climax. And at that big climax, you may have heard the pizzicato strings. Ya da da bum bum, da 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 dum, bum ba da 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 da. You know, Brahms is bringing in the percussion section at the climax of that whole melody. Then he's got a problem, which I hope you noticed he solves quite elegantly, which is he's built up this huge locomotive of rhythmic energy, and rhythmic energy in our nice, happy ya da da 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 da 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 da. Right? It's just marvelous. You want it to go on forever, but he has to somehow get away from it. He's got to come down from the climax. And how, composers get off of a pedestal, a wonderful moment, a climactic moment, is just as interesting as how they get onto it. And in this case, Brahms is very gradually diminishes the energy and the excitement until he gets back to the opening squiggle, and so goes on into the development. Now, 2 things can happen at this point in a sonata movement. One is that you can go all the way back to the beginning and repeat the exposition, which does not happen in this performance. And the other is that you can just continue on. And whether you take a repeat or not is one of those endlessly vexatious questions that people argue about all the time. And some people have very strong feelings about it. I mean, the advantage to taking the exposition is that you get to hear the music again. and it's gorgeous music, so why not? So that's a good thing. In this case, Brahms has taken the trouble to write a fairly lengthy lead back to bring us back to the opening. It's a shame to leave it out because it's done very artfully. Sometimes it's done very inartfully, as in the first movement of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, where the repeat is just horrible. It's just a terrible, terrible, awful interruption of all the momentum that he's built up. And in this case, you could argue, even though Brahms understands the problem, clearly understands the problem, you just don't want to go back. I mean, it's built up so much energy and so much has happened, you want to just move on with it. And that's fair too. It changes the shape of the movement, though. Because if you take the exposition, then part one tends to be as long as part two, which has two sections, a development section and a recapitulation section. So, there's an argument for that. It makes it sound more binary. The two parts are much clearer if you take the exposition. If you don't, it's much more three-party. Exposition, development, recapitulation, which is the way sonata form is usually taught or was taught historically in like music appreciation classes. And the reason it was taught that way is because nobody took repeats until rather recently. It became the custom, especially on recordings, to actually do it. But anyway, they don't do it here, and I don't think it makes any difference. You can hear other performances of the work and decide for yourself which way you prefer to hear it done. There is no right answer. There truly is not. So, the exposition has ended. Next will come the development section. Now, development section is kind of like, again, it's a technical term and it's a terrible name because what really is happening is it's more like the discovery section. It's when we find out who the main characters really are and what it is that they do. What is their expressive potential? What can they say to us? That's what happens in development sections, at least in these big romantic pieces that like Brahms is writing from that period, from the 1860s and 70s to the end of the 19th century. This particular development section is based on two ideas, neither one of which I think you were expecting to have the development section based on. First of all, that glorious second subject, that beautiful tune, that wonderful long lyrical tune has no part in it whatsoever. Zero. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that, I'll tell you what it is that big, gorgeous lyrical tunes are not developable, generally. All you can do is repeat them. Because that's what you want to hear. You want to hear the big, gorgeous development, big, gorgeous lyrical tune. You don't want to hear it taken apart and disassembled, and, or you want to hear it in all of its glory. And so Brahms leaves it that way. He leaves us wanting to hear it again. And when we do hear it in the recapitulation, we hear it, it's like, oh, thank God, it's still there. We're very happy that we get to hear it. But it doesn't do anything else other than provide that wonderful lyrical contrast. So the development section is not going to have the second subject. What it contains is only the first subject and only two bits of the first subject, more or less. You get a little bit of the opening tune, that da 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 da. But it's really based on the squiggle. Just as who knew, right? What can you do with a squiggle? That's why I call this talk the Diary of a Squiggle, because that wada 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 is really the main driver of the entire development section. And you also get a piece, that little tail, da ba da 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 da, from the very end of the first subject. Those are the two things Brahms is going to work with for the most part. And I mean, that's kind of like amazing, isn't it? But I want to play you the two climaxes of the development, of the development section. It rises to two passionate climaxes. The first is based on the tail of the first subject, that da 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 da, and here it is. And the second climax is all based on the squiggle, with a little bit of that up and up and up thrown in. But it's basically everything you can do with a squiggle, and it's the most passionate and dissonant, even painful, pathetic. It's anguished, and it's just a squiggle. It may be anguished because it's just a squiggle, because it wants to express something. It wants to be that gorgeous second subject, and it's not. It's just a poor, lonely squiggle. However you interpret it is entirely up to you. But listen to what Brahms does with this squiggle. And I give you the lead back into the recapitulation, the beginning, the return to the opening, so you can hear just how fabulously it's done and what an unbelievable relief it is when it finally gets there. Isn't that cool? I mean, isn't that just like amazing? Fantastic. Now, one of the things that I think you need to keep in mind when you listen to great music is just this point that we've discussed. It's so important that the unexpected, the developments will always be unexpected in the hands of a great composer. And he's going to reveal expressive potential that you just never would have expected. Never, never, never. It's wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So now we're back to the recapitulation, and I'm not going to play you any of that particularly. You don't really need to hear it, except I want to make a couple of points about it. The recapitulation restates the material from the exposition, the main ideas, except it's not going to suggest that they're going from Brooklyn to Queens. They're going to stay in Brooklyn. Now, Brooklyn is a large borough. They may want to go to the Botanic Gardens. They want to go to Prospect Park. They may want to go out to, Ebbets Field. They may have to, head somewhere else in Brooklyn. So, they can still travel around, but they're not going far. That's the point. The purpose of the exposition is to reestablish order, that feeling of home, that sensation of being where we ought to be. And one of the ways that Brahms does that is by first of all shortening the transitional music, because this just doesn't have to take us where we don't have to go from Brooklyn to Queens. We may only have to go from Williamsburg to Canarsie. You just take the L train, and so it's really very straightforward. So it can be shorter. You can compress and rearrange the material. You will never restate the material exactly as you heard it, because the second subject, which was in a different key originally, is now going to be more or less in the home key. And Brahms drives this home to us in a couple of very, very special ways. First of all, the first subject, when you hear it, when I play the whole movement, is accompanied by lots of pizzicato, outlining the rhythm. It's no longer searching. It's arrived. It has it's not, bold. It's not da, 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 da. No. It hasn't completely become schizophrenic. It's not Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it has acquired a firmness of direction and a firmness of outline that it didn't have, because it has gone through the experience of the development section and it's changed. So then we get the motion music, and when we come to the second subject, it's accompanied much more graphically and clearly by the same squiggle that accompanied the first subject. Wada, 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 wada. So you understand now that somehow the second subject has become part of the entire continuum of the exposition, part of that overall trajectory of one idea in one place. And so you hear it again, And it doesn't have quite that same wonderful feeling of release it had when we first heard it, because we're in the home key. We're already there. So it's less celebratory. It's become a little bit more reticent, just as the first subject has become bolder. And it's a wonderful sort of leveling process that gives us these themes now on the same playing field, as it were. And then once that dies down, we get a coda. Now, every section of this movement is introduced by the squiggle, and so is the coda. And I have put together a little diary of a squiggle that just shows you how each section begins. One after the other. I've stuck some pauses in between them, and they end rather abruptly, so you'll know what I'm talking about. But you hear it 4 times. You hear the exposition, the beginning of the development, the beginning of the recapitulation, and the beginning of the coda. And the beginning of the development is the only one where it's really in a different place. The others are all pretty similar. But you'll notice that the development section sounds very, very different, even though it's the same squiggle. The other 2 are more or less the same. So I want to just play you the evolution of the squiggle, so you can see how each section, or hear how each section begins. And because it's condensed that way, you get a pretty good sense of what the overall, harmonic or tonal trajectory of the thing is. The only section that's really far away from where we started is the beginning of the development section. So here are the squiggles, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I mean, it just did that to give you some, food for thought when you listen to the whole thing. Because now, remains except the coda? Now, a coda means tail. All it is an ending. And in this particular case, it is the search for the ending. Because remember, every single element, like I said, in this movement, every section ends with a return to the squiggle. And you can't just come back to the squiggle and let it die out. That would be just so, lame. And Brahms is many things, but lame he is not. And so he writes a coda. It's only about a minute of music. But what it does is it allows that first subject to sort of look back on where it's been. That's with a little bit of what they call in the biz subdominant harmony. For some reason, if you put it in context, it always evokes this sense of nostalgic relaxation. And that's how it works. I mean, I don't know why, but it does. And you'll hear it. You'll hear it very clearly. This sense of, look at what we've done. Look at what we've accomplished. And so the movement seems to want to end with a squiggle, but it doesn't. It wakes up and has a firm and positive conclusion. So with that, I want to play you the entire movement, which is 10 minutes and 14 seconds. If you were to take the exposition repeat, it would be about 12 or 13 minutes. And, it's a big, serious piece. And what I hope I've been able to impress upon you is that although this is chamber music, and chamber music is intimidating, supposedly, and it's kind of niche repertoire for, a select group of snobby, awful people who you probably don't want to meet, it is actually a simply magnificent, glorious, approachable, fabulous piece of music. And we're going to have such a good time listening to the whole work. I guarantee it. But let's now play the entire first movement with the Stuttgart soloist, with all of the different parts in place where they ought to be. And enjoy it. Just sit back, enjoy it, and let it flow over you. Here it is. That's just gorgeous, isn't it? I mean, don't you want to hear the rest of it now? I mean, where that's going, what's going to happen to it in the next three movements? You know, what more Brahms has up his sleeve? I just think this is such a fantastic journey of discovery, and I hope you agree. I know this has been a very, very long talk, but I tried to pack it as full of music as I could so that we could enjoy it together. So keep on listening, folks. Tune in for How to Listen to Great Music, the Brahms G Major Sextet Part 2, the second movement, which is a scherzo, allegro non troppo. Same tempo as the first movement, actually, although it isn't. And we'll find out why when we get to it. So take care, friends. Bye-bye.